of Women for Progress Radio Network. Hi, I'm Angela Stewart, and I serve as Vice President of Women for Progress, as well as I work at the Margaret Walker Center at Jackson State University, where I am the archivist. Now, what an archivist is a manager of memories. That's what I like to say. I'm in charge of over 40 paper-based collections at the Margaret Walker Center, which range from Margaret Walker's personal papers to Amanda McAuliffe's work of her grandmothers, her recordings of her grandmothers. The Margaret Walker Center also has an oral history division. We have a museum division, and we sponsor the exhibits of the COFO Center, which was the headquarters for Freedom Summer, the summer of 1964. I received my training at Alcorn State University, where I received a bachelor's degree in history. From there, I went to Kent State University, where I received a master's in public history. And I spent a summer at the National Museum of American History, which is part of the Smithsonian Institution, where I had the opportunity to work under the current Smithsonian Institution Secretary, Dr. Lonnie Bunch. I worked for 12 years as archivist at the Piney Woods School in Piney Woods, Mississippi. And then in 2004, I came to Jackson State University. So November 1st, I'll celebrate 17 years at Jackson State University. In addition to my training with the Smithsonian, I also participated in the Modern Archives Institute, which is sponsored by the National Archives and Records Administration, which is located both in Washington, D.C. and College Park, Maryland. And I had an opportunity to work and visit both of those facilities of the National Archives and Records Administration. So that's a little bit about me and my background in education. I am a lover of history and have been since I was a young child. I grew up in a household with two parents who not only were trained in studying and teaching history, but who also were passionate in their love of history as well. So that's why I was happy to participate in this History Matters podcast for Women for Progress Radio Network. And I want to thank Mrs. Willie Jones, who is the president of Women for Progress, and Mrs. Juanita Stewart Brown, who is the executive producer of the Women for Progress Radio Network, for this opportunity. So, a favorite statement of mine is from the Akan people of Ghana, and they have a word called Sankofa, which means what we have lost, forgotten, foregone, or been stripped of can be reclaimed, revived, preserved, and perpetuated. And that is my mantra, my philosophy, and my work as an archivist and as a community cultural activist working with projects such as the Scott Ford Project here in Jackson, in Kwanzaa, which we host every December in Jackson as well. So tonight, I want to start off, I always like to start off by talking about why history matters, because I hear from a lot of people, I didn't like history when I was in school. That was my least favorite subject. It's all dates and remembering people and things like that, but that's not what history is or why it matters. History is a resource. Laura Linney said that, and I agree totally with her. History is a resource. History is the knowledge of and study of the past. It is the story of the past in a form of collective memory. History is the story of who we are, where we come from, and can potentially reveal where we are headed. And that gets back to what I mentioned earlier about Sankofa, looking back to move ahead. Why study history? History is important to study because it is essential for all of us in understanding ourselves and the world around us. There's a history of every field and topic, from medicine to music to art. To know and understand history is absolutely necessary, even though the results of historical study are not as visible and less immediate than some other studies. You know, Marcus Garvey said, a people without a knowledge of their past is like a tree without roots. And it allows us to comprehend more about our world and what's going on in our world, and have a background so that, you know, there's an old saying, there's nothing new under the sun. Everything old is new again. History gives us a very clear picture of how the various aspects of society, such as technology, governmental systems, and even society as a whole, worked in the past, so we can understand how it came to work the way it is now. Studying history allows us to observe and understand how people and societies behaved. For example, we are able to evaluate war, even when a nation is at peace, by looking back at previous events. History provides us with the data that is used to create laws or theories about various aspects of society. You know, a lot of what we've learned during this time of pandemic can be gleaned from a previous pandemic. 1918, 1919, the world experienced the Spanish flu influenza epidemic. At that time, it was also a time of great racial upheaval, very much mirroring what we are going through now. So by looking back at those events and seeing how we were able to come through those events can help us as we are entering year 2 of a worldwide pandemic that is going to change our world and leave us with a very new normal. Life is not going to go back to pre-2020. We have to keep moving forward. And, you know, history provides us a sense of identity. And that's one of the reasons why it's still taught. That's one of the reasons why people have such problems with ideas such as critical race theory, is because it's about who we are as individuals, as community, as races, as nations, as even an entire world. So these are some of the reasons why history is important. And it helps us to not only look at the past, but how are we going to construct our lives and develop an agenda for action for the future. So it helps us to understand present day issues by asking deeper questions as to why things are the way they are. Why is Jackson the way it is? You know, if we look at history, and not even just the history of Jackson, but the history of urban communities throughout the United States, we can see why Jackson is the way it is in 2021. So that is something else as to why it's important to look at history. And it helps us to look at not only what happened in the past, but how can we learn from that and going forward in the future and providing better schools, better homes, better health, better education for communities today. Better change. You know, change is inevitable and it's constant, but we can make sure that we have positive change in our communities. I want to start tonight by talking about, this is October. Today is October 21st, 2021. And as I said, you are listening to History Matters podcast provided by Women for Progress Radio Network. And I want to start off with Jackson State University. Jackson State University is celebrating its founding in October. Jackson State University was founded October 23rd, 1877 in Natchez, Mississippi as Natchez Seminary, a place to train preachers and teachers. The individuals who created what was then Natchez Seminary, now Jackson State University, felt that there were two key things that individuals coming out of enslavement, out of the Civil War needed, and that was education and faith. They needed education and a moral grounding to help them make progress. Jackson State University was founded by a coalition of formerly enslaved and free individuals, as well as the American Baptist Home Mission Society, to provide a place to train preachers and teachers to move the community forward. Because even coming out of the Civil War, coming out of Reconstruction, coming into what would be a most difficult period for African Americans, not only in Mississippi, but throughout the United States. And that's the period of Jim Crow. These individuals knew it's not just about me. It's about what can I do to move my community forward? What can I do to make sure that individuals coming behind me have a better life? And they knew they could do it. One of the old mottos at an institution where I used to work, the Ponywood School, was, there are no outs. Despite all the difficulties, they knew that they could make a better future for themselves and their community. And that's why Jackson State was founded in 1877. So on October 23rd, which is just less than 2 days away, we will celebrate Jackson State's founding as an institution of higher learning, as an institution of cultural advancement, as an institution of technological advancement for not just African Americans, but for people in general throughout this world. So I wanted to start with that little plug for Jackson State. This has been a great month for Jackson State. We invested our latest president, President Thomas Hudson, just last week. We celebrated a wonderfully successful homecoming, not just in winning the game, which we did. We beat Alabama State 28-7, but we had over 50,000 people in Jackson for Jackson State's homecoming, one of the largest attendance Jackson State has had for a homecoming. And the week went off successfully. And it showed what we can do as Jacksonians, both Jackson State Jacksonians and citizens of Jackson and throughout the world. So, as I mentioned earlier, I am the archivist at the Margaret Walker Center. We just finished a wonderful exhibit called Evicted that looked at the impact of evictions on marginalized communities and vulnerable individuals and provided deep insight into eviction and what it means beyond just someone losing their home, what it means to families, what it means to children, what it means to communities, what it means to economies. That exhibit ended October 3rd, but we're always on the move at the Margaret Walker Center. So we have a new project going now entitled Stitch Their Name, the foundation of stitching racial violence and advocacy. Stitch Their Names is a quilt exhibition created by cross-stitchers and quilters across the country and beyond. The goal is to honor the legacy of Black individuals for whom racism and hate have led to their deaths. Many hearts and hands, close to 100 people, work to stitch individual portraits of those who have died. Each individual loss represents tremendous grief and pain to those who love them and to their entire community. The portraits were lovingly stitched together into 2 quilted art pieces that travel and are displayed throughout the country. In doing so, the group hopes to bring additional critical awareness to the collective loss and the horrific magnitude of Black persons targeted by racism and bigotry in this country. The Margaret Walker Center will host 2 public programs in conjunction with the event. The Foundation of Stitching, Racial Violence and Advocacy will be a virtual event on Margaret Walker Center's Facebook page and YouTube page at 6 p.m. Thursday, October 28th, so a week from today. And it would be an hour-long program from 6 to 7 p.m. This discussion will include Holly Johannes, the founder of Stitch Their Names, as well as Tiffany Burns and Maddie Winters, 2 of the contributors to the quilt. Moderated by Dr. Tiffany Caesar, Margaret Walker Center Mellon Visiting Scholar. The participants will address the inspiration for the project, its creation, and the intersection of activism and art. One of our key tenets at the Margaret Walker Center is the importance of the intersection of activism and art. It's something that we are inspired to continue by our founder, Dr. Margaret Walker Alexander, who founded the Institute for the Study of the History, Life, and Culture of Black People in 1968 as part of her agenda for action in terms of combining activism and arts. And in addition to that program, which will be on October 28th at 6 p.m. virtually on both Facebook Live and the Margaret Walker Center YouTube page, there's another program that will be an in-person program, Activism in Quilts, Art, and Music. And this will be held where we're located at Jackson State Air Hall. 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. will be a reception. 6 p.m. to 7:30 will be a in-person program. And this will be Thursday, November 18th. This program will begin with a reception and light refreshments along with a viewing of the quilts. A panel discussion will feature Dr. Ebony Lumumba, Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of English, who will discuss her research on how quilting merges art and activism. Dr. C. Sade Turnipseed, Assistant Professor of History, will discuss her work with quilts, how their artwork discuss her work with quilts. Jackson State alumnus Theron Wilkerson and current JSU student Elijah Kareem will examine how their artwork and poetry engage activism. The exhibitions and programs are free and open to the public. And so we invite you to come to the Margaret Walker Center, which is located on the main campus of Jackson State University in historic Air Hall. We're open Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. And the exhibit of the quilts will be there, as well as the event on November 18th will also be at the Margaret Walker Center. So that is my little commercial for the Margaret Walker Center. We do look forward to having you visit us. We are, as I mentioned, we are open 8 to 5 as a resource and museum for the general public, for Jackson State students, faculty, and staff, for researchers, for tourists as well. And I just want to mention also, we sponsor and provide tours of what is called the COFO Civil Rights Education Center, which is located on Lynch Street and has a very rich power of place because it is the place where Bob Moses, Dave Dennis, and others organized Freedom Summer, the summer of 1964. COFO stands for Council of Federated Organizations, and that council included the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the CORE, which is Congress of Racial Equality, and Southern Christian Leadership Conference. These organizations came together to work in Mississippi for civil rights and education, and they would also develop what would become known as the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. So we also offer tours of that space. It's a wonderful museum. You can reach out to the Margaret Walker Center by phone 601-979-3935, 601-979-3935. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We are also have a website on the World Wide Web, which is jsums.edu/Margaret Walker Center, or just Google Margaret Walker Center, and you can find our website that way. So thanks again for joining us tonight. Again, as I said, this is the History Matters podcast for Women for Progress Radio, October 21st, 2021. And so glad to have you listening with us. This week, just 3 days ago, we lost Colin Powell. Colin Powell was born April 5th, 1937, and died on October 18th, 2021. He was a U.S. general and statesman. He was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, 1989 to 1993, and Secretary of State, 2001 to 2005. And he was the first African-American to hold either of those positions. He was the son of Jamaican immigrants. He grew up in Harlem, New York, and the South Bronx sections of New York City, and attended the City College of New York and served in the ROTC. He entered the Army upon graduation, served in Vietnam from 62 to 63 and 68 to 69, and then studied at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. In 1972, he took his first political position as a White House fellow and soon became assistant to Frank Carlucci, then deputy director of the Office of Management and Budget, known as the OMB. He held various positions over the next few years in the Pentagon and elsewhere. In 1983, he became senior military assistant to the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger. In 1987, he joined the staff of the National Security Council as deputy to Carlucci, then assistant to the president for national security affairs. Late in 1987, President Ronald Reagan appointed Powell to succeed Carlucci. Early in 1989, Powell took over the Armed Forces Command. In 1989, he became a four-star general. And in August, President George Bush nominated him chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. As chairman, he played a leading role in planning the invasion of Panama in 1989 and the Desert Shield and Desert Storm operations of the Persian Gulf Crisis and War, August 1990 to March 1981. He retired from the military in 1993. And although he decided not to run for president, he would become the first African-American to serve as Secretary of State, serving, as I mentioned, in George W. Bush's first administration. General Powell represents a tradition of African Americans in the military that spans back to the American Revolution. African Americans ascending to the position of general is still not as widespread as it should be. When we think of African American generals, I think of people such as both Benjamin O. Davis, Sr. and Jr., Daniel Chappie James, and others who became leaders in the military. And we know that Colin Powell also has a problematic past. He was responsible for guiding us into the Gulf War after the Twin Towers, after 9/11. They talked about weapons of mass destruction, and it's been proven that there were no weapons of mass destruction. But he spent the bulk of his life after he left politics, after he left the military, being a statesman and a leader and a supporter of community events. So we do send out our deepest sympathy to his wife, Alma Johnson Powell, his children, Linda, Anne Marie, and Michael, and his grandchildren and others at this time of grief. He represents also someone who died of complications of COVID-19. So, I talked a little bit earlier about the pandemic. We are still losing people now. Here again with Colin Powell, he had pre-existing conditions. He suffered from multiple myeloma, which is a blood disorder, which would make him very vulnerable to COVID-19. But I just want to mention that because we are still looking at a pandemic. We are still needing to get people vaccinated to fight this pandemic. And yes, there are now talks about boosters, not only for the Pfizer vaccine, but also Moderna, and even Johnson & Johnson will have boosters that individuals may have to take in order to keep us safe from COVID-19. So in the loss of Colin Powell, we lost a remarkable and loving husband, father, grandfather, and great American, his family said in a statement. So let's think about and remember Colin Powell, his legacy, and also let him remind us that we still need to be vigilant in terms of COVID-19 and precautions. So whenever necessary, wear your mask, socially distance. I know a lot of people don't like to talk about that now. They say, we're past all that, but we still need to be careful and safe, if not for ourselves, for vulnerable family members we may have. Something else that celebrated an anniversary this year, a 30-year anniversary, Anita Hill's testimony on Capitol Hill. How many of you remember watching live or on tape Anita Hill's testimony? I'm going to tell my age, but I was very, very young, but I remember the televised Watergate hearings. And then the next thing I remember in terms of that would be the Anita Hill hearings. And she shined a spotlight on gender violence and sexual harassment as issues in the American society and in the American workplace. Now, gender-based violence is violence that is directed at an individual based on his or her biological sex or gender identity. It includes physical, sexual, verbal, emotional, and psychological abuse, threats, coercion, and economic or educational deprivation, whether occurring in public or private life. Gender-based violence is an issue faced by people all over the world. Women are disproportionately harmed by gender-based violence. That is why hundreds of organizations focus on ending violence against women. According to the United Nations Population Fund, 1 in 3 women have experienced physical or sexualized violence in their lifetime. That is not including emotional, financial, or verbal abuse. Despite being so prevalent, gender-based violence is largely underreported because of stigma and lack of access to resources and support systems. How many of you work in jobs that require you to participate in some kind of sexual harassment training? I work at Jackson State, and one of the things we have to do on occasion is sexual harassment training. We have to do training in, implicit bias, active shooter, because that's the kind of world we live in now, where we have to do periodically active shooter training as well. But it's important because gender-based violence can impact anyone regardless of their geographical location, socioeconomic background, race, religion, sexuality, or gender identity. While women and girls are most at risk and the most affected by gender-based violence, boys, men, and sexual and gender minorities also experience gender-based violence. Gender-based violence can have serious physical, mental, economic, and social repercussions. For example, sexualized violence can lead to unwanted pregnancies, unsafe abortions, and sexually transmitted diseases, as well as isolation and depression. It can also prevent survivors from achieving economic prosperity because of stigma or physical and psychological trauma caused by the violence. The prevalence of gender-based violence worldwide is largely due to systemic gender inequality that disempowers women, girls, and other minorities and stifles their voices so that their stories are not heard and their natural human rights can be more easily taken away. I mentioned earlier that I work with the Scott Forward Project. And one of the things we are looking at is systemic violence and how it impacted granny midwives who were functioning as primary caregivers for pregnant women and children in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries in Mississippi. But as the field of obstetrics took hold, the medical field of taking care of pregnant women or women who want to become pregnant and newborns took hold, granny midwives were oftentimes forced out of positions. At one point, there were as many as probably 4,000 to 5,000 what we call granny or lay midwives. And a lay midwife is simply a midwife who learned her craft by apprenticing under another midwife or maybe even a doctor. These mostly women didn't have any formal professional training as midwives, but they had wonderful years of experience taking care of mothers and babies in communities. But as men began to take over the space that had been previously a primarily female space of midwives, mothers, and babies, and it became a medical space of mostly male doctors and women and babies. Granny midwives were pushed out, and this systemic gender inequality and racism were at the heart of this. So this is what this is talking about in terms of this gender-based violence, because sometimes the violence isn't physical, it's economic. And that's what granny midwives experience. So there are all kinds of intersections. You usually think when you're talking about Anita Hill, you're just talking about some comments Clarence Thomas made to her that made her feel less than and uncomfortable. But it's broader than that. Gender-based violence is broader than that. And women and girls need to know that it's wrong and that they don't have to accept or put up with it. So that's another important thing that Anita Hill opened up, a discussion of it's not right to have to go to a job and feel violated and uncomfortable and just deal with it just so you could have a job. Supervisors and employers and coworkers don't have a right to do that to you. And this is what the Anita Hill case helped to bring out, in making sure that we understand that we have power and we have a right to safety and security in our own persons, both physically and emotionally. But you saw the uneven power dynamic when Anita Hill was speaking before Congress. All the people she was speaking to were men, white men, who went out of their way to make her feel uncomfortable, to make her feel like she wasn't telling the truth or she was exaggerating. And it's not even a racial thing, because when Brett Kavanaugh was nominated here again for the United States Supreme Court, Ms. Ford, who accused him of misconduct, was made to feel the same way. And you got that sense of shame that kept her from coming forward in the first place. And the irony of it all is that Clarence Thomas was accused of harassing her while he was chair of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC. And she was working there as an advisor. I mean, let that sink in. He's working as chairman of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and he's being accused of sexual harassment. The U.S. Senate ultimately confirmed Thomas's nomination in a 52-48 vote, and Hill went home to a new life, condemned by many and facing death threats. Nevertheless, she has no regrets about stepping forward. She says, "I had important information about an individual who was picked to sit for a lifetime appointment to our nation's highest court. It was not just a professional duty as a lawyer, but I believed it was my ethical responsibility to come forward in the best way and the most effective way that I could. And that's what I did." So she's saying, the United States Supreme Court, persons who are nominated and selected and actually get picked to be on the United States Supreme Court, that's a lifetime position. They make monumental decisions that affect our lives. Let's look at some Supreme Court decisions. In 1857, the United States Supreme Court, in the Dred Scott decision, said that Dred Scott had no right to freedom because as an enslaved person, he had no rights that any white man was bound to respect. And that slavery couldn't be limited to just the boundaries that had been set by the Missouri Compromise. The United States Supreme Court legitimized, with that decision, slavery. They legitimized the idea that was embodied in the U.S. Constitution that said Africans, Americans were 3/5 of a person. All of that came out of a United States Supreme Court decision. In 1896, the United States Supreme Court, in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, said separate but unequal was constitutional. That it was within a state and a community's right to have separate facilities for everyone so long as they were, quote, equal. Most times for African Americans, facilities may have been separate. Education may have been separate, but it was rarely equal. In 1954, the Supreme Court in Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, et al., said that separate but equal in terms of education was unconstitutional. And it led to a ultimately 16-year fight to integrate public schools. And we are still living with the effects of the integration of public schools that was kicked off by the Brown versus the Board of Education decision. Roe v. Wade, which made abortion legal in the United States, is something that has affected not only women who want to choose whether they give birth or not, but to families, communities, religions, politics, all have been drastically affected by the Roe v. Wade decision. And I mention all this because 9 people sitting on the United States Supreme Court and the people who work with them make these decisions. So that's why Anita Hill was saying she needed to come forward. She had an ethical, not just a, professional responsibility because she was a lawyer and a law professor, but as a human being and knowing what kind of human being Clarence Thomas was, she had a right to make sure that the Senate Judicial Committee knew that. Now, the chair of the Senate Judicial Committee at that time was our current president, Joseph Biden. And I would recommend, if you get a chance, that's the wonder of YouTube. You can pull up at least clips of the Anita Hill confirmation hearings. I mean, the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings and Anita Hill's testimony during those confirmation hearings. And, and it also should make us stop and think about, are these the best ways to select people for the highest court in the land? Are these the best ways to choose federal judges? To have them be basically picked by judicial committees that oftentimes have more political agendas than they have experience and expertise in selecting somebody to sit on the federal bench, whether it be district court or circuit court or the United States Supreme Court. So these are some things to think about. And it's all about knowing you did the right thing. Because Anita Hill says, even though Clarence Thomas was confirmed, I do believe that what I did was effective because it opened the conversation publicly in a way that had never been done before. I've heard from people whose lives have been changed because that conversation was open. What are some conversations we need to have or continue now to make lives better, or to at least open up ideas? And what are some conversations we need to have? I live in Jackson, Mississippi. What are some conversations we need to have about politics and education and economic development in Jackson, Mississippi, in Hinds County? What are some conversations we need to have with our state elected officials, our state legislators, our community leaders, our religious leaders, about how we make Jackson a place with streets fit to live in, to be safe in, make sure that children have the best education they can possibly have. The late Bob Moses said that the fight of the 21st century is for quality public education. Quality public education. And that is something that we need to have discussions about. So Anita Hill reminds us that not only if we see something that we feel is wrong, Vernon Johns used to say that if you see a good fight, get in it. But sometimes we need to have discussions because we need to broaden horizons. We need to think about an agenda for action, for improving conditions in communities and lives. You know, there are a lot of painful people who are living in circumstances, whether it be homeless, whether it be in a violent, abusive situation, who need people to reach out and say, you know, this is not right. There is something that needs to be done. There should be ways for people to have communities and schools where individuals can thrive and feel safe. You know, Willie says Anita Hill felt a personal, moral, and ethical responsibility to act. The importance of communities and individuals to feel inspired and motivated to act. You know, when Whitney Houston and George Benson sang it, it got so popular till it almost became a cliche, but they sang a song that said, children are our future. Treat them well and let them lead the way. Are we treating children well in our communities? Are we making sure that they have what they need so that they can be leaders, so that they can have communities where they feel safe and can thrive and can help our communities thrive? You know, we've been in the midst of a pandemic. COVID-19 has been around since 2019, which is how it got the name COVID-19. But we experienced, at least in Mississippi, our first lockdown in March of 2020. So, and we're still grappling with social distancing and do we go back to regathering in churches? Do we go maskless? Do we wear a mask? Do we get vaccinated? Do we not get vaccinated? Do we take boosters? And there's been a lot of isolation. There's been a lot of frustration and anger and depression. And I had the opportunity to read an article today that took a very different approach, and I want to just share some things that Jamil Zaki said in an article today in the Atlantic.com. The Atlantic Monthly is a magazine that's been around for over 100 years. People such as Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois and Frederick Douglass wrote articles in the Atlantic Monthly, but it's now also available for subscription online. But Jamil says, but self-care alone won't fulfill people's psychological needs as we rebound from the pandemic. After many months in relative isolation, we must reclaim connection and meaning. That comes not just from caring for ourselves, but also caring for one another. So how do we do that? How do we do that in a world where we're still mostly connecting with people via Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Zoom, feed loop, virtual and hybrid meetings? How do we do that? You know, and he says when people reflect on what matters to them most in life, social connections perennially top their list. Even as we emerge from social distancing practices, it's easy to miss those connections. People are still adapting to reentry and rebuilding atrophied social muscles. Although self-care soothes, it can be too individualistic to help with loneliness. Me time is great, truly, but human flourishing is typically out there with everyone else. So I want you to think about, how do we get out there with everyone else? How do we make sure we don't just have, as Jamil says, we don't just have me time, but we have others' time. How do we do that? I am a Christian. I am a student of the Bible. I attend Sunday school and small group Bible study. And one of my favorite passages is from Isaiah chapter 58. As he talks about this other time as well. You know, and I want to just set it up. In the 50th chapter of Isaiah, the people of Judah are like, you know, we've been in exile and now we're back, and we've been pretty good. We've been doing what the Lord asked us to do, but we still don't feel connected. We still don't feel like we have what we need to be who we need to be. And Isaiah listens to them complain and feel sorry for themselves and, you know, say, woe is me, why isn't God answering our prayers the way we think he should? And he says this to them. And this is Isaiah 58, starting at verse 6. Isn't this the fast I choose? And he's speaking for God. To break the chains of wickedness, to untie the ropes of the yoke, to set the oppressed free, and to tear off every yoke. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, to bring the poor and homeless into your house, to clothe the naked when you see him, and not to ignore your own flesh and blood? Then your light will appear like the dawn, and your recovery will come quickly. Your righteousness will go before you, and the Lord's glory will be your rear guard. At that time, when you call, the Lord will answer. When you cry out, he will say, here I am. If you get rid of the yoke among you, the finger pointing and malicious speaking, and if you offer yourself to the hungry and satisfy the afflicted one, then your light will shine in the darkness, and your night will be like noonday. The Lord will always lead you, satisfy you in a parched land, and strengthen your bones. You will be like a watered garden, like a spring whose water never runs dry. Some of you will rebuild the ancient ruins. You will restore the foundations laid long ago. You will be called the repairers of broken walls, the restorer of streets where people live. So when I, read Jamil's article today, it immediately took me back to Isaiah 58. And because just like now, Isaiah was calling people to get out of their me, and said, think about what about others and how thinking about others will bless them, but not only bless them, but you notice in that passage, bless their communities. Jamil says people are psychologically intertwined such that helping others is a kindness to ourselves. And that's what Isaiah was saying. When we're kind to others, we're kind to ourselves. And watching over ourselves support others. So it's not just about, what do I need, but what does my community need? In the 1960s, the Black Panther Party launched survival programs, mutual aid efforts designed to encourage preventative medicine, nutrition, and exercise in response to the lack of high-quality healthcare access many Black Americans faced. Activists such as Angela Davis and Erica Hudgens broadened this approach to include practices such as mindfulness and yoga, more along the lines of what we now understand as self-care. But their version was still firmly grounded in community. As they saw it, self-care among Black people, especially Black women, was a radical act, denying the oppression that would reduce them. It was also a way to continue pushing against that oppression and toward justice. Angela Davis said, anyone who is interested in making change in the world also has to learn to take care of herself. Okay, and we have a question from Dr. Tiffany Caesar, who is our Mellon Scholar at the Margaret Walker Center. And thank you, Tiffany. She says, can you discuss the parallel of Margaret Walker and Anita Hill as it concerns the encounters they both had from administrators displaying various forms of patriarchy and sexism? Again, that is a very good question. Margaret Walker wrote very frankly about the issues she faced with administrators at Jackson State University. Margaret Walker came to Jackson State in 1949. She was a mother with 3 young children and a disabled husband. And the university male leadership took every opportunity to demean and diminish her because they felt like she was in a situation she couldn't leave. They were like, where is she going? She has these young children and a husband who needs help. So, and she talks frankly about, women, especially Black women, have a double burden of race and sexism. Most of Margaret Walker's career, even though she may have been better educated than most of her colleagues, she was always less paid. She was expected, as the Bible would say, to make bricks without straw. But like Anita Hill, there is always that diminishment of the worth of Black women And I think that's something she and Margaret Walker had in common. What these Black men, whether it be Clarence Thomas or Henry T. Sampson or Jacob L. Reddix, were saying by their actions and sometimes by their words is that Black women don't matter. Their feelings that don't matter. Their bodies, their rights don't matter. So just as Anita Hill talked about 30 years ago, Margaret Walker was talking about from 49 through her retirement at Jackson State in 79 and beyond, that women have a double burden and often a double responsibility to look at both the impact of being, as she said, Black, female, and free. So thank you, Tiffany, Dr. Tiffany Caesar, for that question. And she will be moderating one of our events for the Quilt Stitch Their Names program at the Margaret Walker Center. Another question, what will be the lasting legacy of the Anita Hill testimony? I think what it already is this opening discussion and dialogue about what it means, what sexual harassment means, what it means to be a Black woman in a workplace, what not only racial dynamics, but gender dynamics, sexual dynamics, because you have to understand Clarence Thomas is a Black man, Anita Hill is a Black woman. So these problems they were having aren't race-based, they're gender and sexual based. So I think, and a lot of times, I had a supervisor when I worked at Piney Woods who said when a group of women opposed her talking about issues facing young girls, she said, well, you all have been abused so long and so much that you don't even see it as abuse anymore. So that's something else Anita Hill did. It opened people's eyes, because oftentimes people say, well, that's just, the price of working. You just grin and bear it. But Anita Hill's testimony allowed people to recognize that, no, this isn't right. And we don't have to just take it. So I think that's going to be her lasting legacy, allowing us to open up discussions about hard topics, about painful topics, about traumatic topics that have been facing us for generations, and seeing how do we move forward from conversation to solutions. I want to thank everybody who has participated this evening. This has been a wonderful discussion. We have talked about history and why history matters. We've talked about the late General Colin Powell, and more on his loss. And we also talked about Anita Hill. Oh, and we have another question. Colin Powell a statement. Colin Powell can be considered an example of accountable leadership. Does this still exist with current national leaders? Yes, if we make sure it does. The only reason why leaders aren't held accountable is because we don't hold them accountable. Abraham Lincoln once said that the only people who matter are people who vote. So we have to keep them accountable. That's our responsibility as citizens, to hold leadership accountable and make sure that they're doing what they need to do. Okay, and also I see Announcement, join Kwanzaa Planning 2021, text 601. To join Kwanzaa Planning 2021, text 601-259-6770 to join the planning, or email mail@womenforprogress.net. Kwanzaa Planning meeting will be October 24th at 7 p.m. So thank you, Willie, for sharing that. As I mentioned earlier, for over 30 years, Women for Progress of Mississippi has been sponsoring an annual Kwanzaa celebration here in Jackson. Since December 2017, we have been hosting the celebration at the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. Last year, due to COVID, we were virtual for the first time, but the plans are to go back responsibly in person this December. Kwanzaa is a celebration that was created by Dr. Malana Karenga in 1966. Kwanzaa is literally Swahili for first fruits. It's a celebration of 7 principles, which are known collectively as Nguzo Saba, which is Swahili for 7 principles. And the principles are Umoja, which is unity, Kujishangilia, which is self-determination, Ujima, which is collective work and responsibility, Ujama, cooperative economics, Nia, which is purpose, Kuumba, which is creativity, and Imani, faith. In a general Kwanzaa celebration, you would celebrate each of these principles in turn on 7 different nights, starting December 26th and ending on January 1st. And the idea is to not just celebrate the principle, but put plans in place as to how we can make these principles a reality. As I mentioned, Kwanzaa is a celebration that's near and dear to my heart because my late mother, Mrs. Dorothy Thompson Stewart Samuel, who was the founder of Women for Progress. She founded Women for Progress in May 1978. She was the driving force behind our initial Kwanzaa celebrations and just made sure that not only Women for Progress members, but the community at large, especially children, had the opportunity to be impacted by Kwanzaa and the principles of Kwanzaa. Again, I'm Angela Stewart. I am Vice President of Women for Progress of Mississippi. As I mentioned earlier, I'm also Archivist at the Margaret Walker Center. I want to thank you for joining us for our monthly podcast, History Matters, which is a podcast of Women for Progress Radio Network. And I also want to thank Mrs. Willie Jones for being with me tonight, she is the president of Women for Progress of Mississippi, and she is a board member at the Margaret Walker Center. So I owe her thanks on 2 levels. And also, I want to thank Mrs. Juanita Stewart Brown, who is executive producer of the Women for Progress Radio Network, and who asked and has allowed me to do this History Matters podcast on 3rd Thursdays of the month at 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. Thank you.